Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Disaffamy History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode of Disaffamy History Podcast, host Wendy Aris sits down with Dr. Christopher Stuart Taylor to explore his groundbreaking book, Flying Fish, in the Great White North, the autonomous migration of Black Barbadians. Together, they uncover the powerful, often overlooked history of Caribbean migration to Canada, focusing on agency, identity, community building, and the ways Barbadians shaped their own futures in the Great White North. Tune in for a deep, engaging conversation on movement, belonging, and the resilience of Caribbean people. So let's have a listen and enjoy the episode.
Professor Stuart Taylor, for coming on to the podcast and speaking about your book, Flying Fish in the Great White North, the autonomous migration of Black Barbadians. And before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Even when I saw the invitation come, I'm like, people are still reading this book. I mean, it came out in 2016, so I really appreciate that. So yeah, my full name is Christopher Stuart Taylor, and that's very important. I know we're going to touch on names here as well. I am currently the Associate Vice President of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism at the University of Waterloo. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Waterloo. So that's my quick introduction to who I am, but I know as we go through the podcast, folks are going to learn a lot more about myself, my family's history, and, the future, not just the past, but the future.
Exactly. And we'll start in terms of, the big question, the why. What inspired you to delve into this topic of Black Barbadian migration? And, is there a personal connection to this history?
So I guess I'm going to give the long and short, but short and long answer. This was never a book that I envisioned to write. In school, I had the typical, second generation West Indian newcomer immigrant upbringing that, there's only 3 occupations: doctor, lawyer, maybe a dentist. Now it's kind of like an engineer. You're okay to go that particular route. And so going through undergraduate at the University of Toronto, I got into law school, whole shebang, that was it. But it wasn't for me, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't at the time because I used to see people, the law life, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. I'm not ready for that. And it's interesting, and younger folks, young people, I guess I'm old enough now I can say young people, which is still mind-boggling to me that, I see young people is a lot of times it's that one teacher or instructor or professor you have that can completely shift the trajectory of not just your career, but of your life. And so I had a class in one of my last years as an undergraduate, and it was about diasporic identities. And in this class, and I'll name drop the person because, somebody I'm still in touch with, Professor Rima Burns-McCown. It was the first time in my academic career that we were forced, in a good way, to learn about ourselves. And no one ever asked me a question about who I am. This whole second generation Black identity, like, what is that? You're a young Black man, go and get paid, try to stay out of jail, be an athlete. That's literally the type of models that we were, taught and told to do. And so in this class, learn about myself and learn about my identities and who I am. And from there, it really sparked an intellectual curiosity. You have this personal curiosity. I really want to know about family, dual citizen, back and forth from Barbados, my whole life. But now it's like, wait a minute, I have time dedicated to learn about myself in books, in archives. Like, this is just to think about who I am. And so from there, I'm like, what? I'm not going to go to law school. I'll defer a year. And then a year became decades, but that's neither here nor there. And to learn, and from going to my PhD, and even when I was doing my PhD, it was really, again, about learning about myself. So it's all about, second generation and Black identity. So I was living in Tanzania, in Mwanza, and Arusha, and I was comparing Black identity in Barbados, in the Caribbean, the UK/Canada, and in East Africa. And as life goes, my father died suddenly. And once my father died suddenly, life is interesting because life doesn't stop. It might stop for you, but life doesn't stop. And so in that moment, I said, you know what? I have an opportunity to do something a bit different. And before my father died, I had just, when your parents or grandparents get older, you're like, hey, you really should write down your stories. Write down your stories. And so I told him, just write down, write a memoir. So after he died and, going through people's stuff, and he actually started. And so I was reading this and I was like, wait a second. This is what the dissertation is going to be about. It's going to be about his life and also my mother's life, their trajectories. So that's where the dissertation became from, tying that historical narrative, going in the archives, reading the books, but really telling his story of growing up in Barbados, not being able to finish high school, costs, and so on and so forth. He was a part of the Windrush generation. My mother was a teacher in Barbados and coming to Canada and so on and so forth. So that was the crux. Unfortunately, it was his death that shifted my trajectory, but also, fortunately, it was his death that shifted that trajectory.
And sometimes it takes those moments in order for things to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah. So your title is extremely powerful, Flying Fish in the Great White North. Can you share the meaning behind how it captures the experience of migration and, of course, the identity and adaptation?
First of all, it's a fantastic question because everybody's like, flying fish, what's that? As any West Indian, any Bajan who's watching, is listening, understands that flying fish, some Trinidadians and Trinbagans, they may be like, no, it's ours, but hey, officially, flying fish is, cuckoo and flying fish, Barbados' national dish. So flying fish, you see the movement of a fish gliding over the sea. And so flying fish represents Barbadians, Bajans, right? And then the Great White North is being in Canada. So it's that poetic space to it of, hey, you're walking through a library or in a bookstore, you see flying fish of the Great White North. You're like, whoa, this is interesting. But it's really telling the story about these Bajans who exist in the Great White North. And not just the Great White North of Canada, but Blackness in literally the Great White North.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you explore laws, which is very important, and policies that shaped migration patterns. Can you just walk us through how certain legal frameworks encourage or restrict who is able to migrate to Canada or other northern regions?
Look, folks, one of the things is I like to, in my classrooms, in my teachings, I really call these diachronic realities, right? How the past influence the present. So, for example, for folks who, are watching and listening in Canada, over the past few years, they may say, well, how come Black newcomers and Black refugees were treated so unfairly, particularly in the streets of Toronto? Like, don't we have laws and policies that privilege, for example, the Syrian refugees or whomever else have came, Ukrainian refugees around the same time? But why are we seeing these images of Black folks outside and housed on the streets? And I say, pause for a second, right? Yes, there is a fundamental and foundational anti-Blackness rooted in Canadian sensibilities. If you look at the work, for example, of Professor Barrington Walker, you're looking at what he calls a liberal racial order. Canada's fundamental legal and policy foundations are built on anti-Blackness. So I'll give you a prime example. In 1906 and 1910, Canada's immigration policies were rooted in racist principles. In 1910, Canada could explicitly bar, they didn't say Black people, but this one, could explicitly bar racialized folks. And for the record, in Canada, they're doing the same thing around Chinese migrants and so on and so forth, based on one's race. And there's a little caveat there, and that's funny. And we're talking about going to archives.
Mm.
Going to archives, and you see these letters that are coming from immigration officials, immigration agents, to particularly Asian and West Indian folks, saying, you can't come here because it's too cold.
Mm.
And within these immigration policies, they call something called climate discrimination. And it boggles my brain. If you think about that, 115 years later, 115, 116 years later, that somebody looked outside and said, it's too cold for black people here. You're designed for the tropics. This is why you can't come to Canada. And we have policies and we have laws that are driving that, full stop. And on top of that, 1911, you have Laurier, who had one of the first and only ordering councils in the world that was going to never got passed, but was going to explicitly bar black people from into this country. So when people ask the question all the time, how come we have so few black people in Canada? First of all, we've always been here. That's another conversation. It's literally for half a generation, half a century, until 1962 and the official deracialization of Canadian immigration policy. 1962, funny enough, by a white woman, but hey, this is our histories. Black people could not come here, period. So it's very important for us to understand why the populations are so low. And I'm using population plural deliberately, are so low because there's laws that said you couldn't come here, period. And that frames, again, these diasporic realities, why black people are seeing that they shouldn't be here because they've never been here, but they were here, and the laws and policies said you couldn't be here.
So it's just a very interesting dynamic, interesting pull on how laws were done. But again, historically, what really pushed or pulled Black Barbadians to migrate northward? Was it economic opportunity, or was it political change or social mobility?
So it's interesting you say that, because one of the, when you're doing any kind of academic, dissertation work, you're always supposed to look at, do a historiography or a literature review and, find what folk have spoken about and challenge that or create a new space. And there are two particular scholars who framed that West Indians, Caribbean people, had a culture of migration. That they, because of, and they didn't say this explicitly, but because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of enslavement, where black peoples were forcibly removed from the African continent. Millions of black people were forcibly removed from the African continent. Moving and leaving and transnationalism was just innate to us. It was normal. It was just something that we did. And I said, time out. I was like, wait a second. Okay, but if someone's forcibly removing you from somewhere, and then you're saying this now is a part of the culture to leave, and that's why if you look at the second part of the book, so Flying Fish in the Great White North, the autonomous migration of Black Barbadians, that completely removes the agency of a person. That you're always a quote-unquote victim of a system. And I said, that's not quite it there. And if you look at the Caribbean, and I touch on this, I know my book focuses on Barbados, but I touch on this, throughout and looking at all in this space, I'm going to use West Indian. And so if I flip between West Indian and Caribbean people, it's deliberate. So when I say West Indian, I'm speaking of the English-speaking former British colonies. A lot of folks will talk about the Caribbean, like, are we talking about Martinique? Are we talking about Haiti? Are we talking about Cuba? Are we? So I'm really focusing on the former British colonies. So if you look at them, and I give a larger example that folks may or may not know about, the Panama Canal. Historical documents will show you that, and if you ever have an opportunity, or if you're watching this in Panama or Latin America, there were a lot of West Indians building the Panama. A lot of whom had families and then went back, but that's neither here nor there. A lot of West Indians and a lot of Bajans in Panama, a lot of Jamaicans in Panama building it, and that's global history. That's one of the wonders of the world built there. So from that, there is a lot of economic opportunities. If you look at Barbados is 166 square miles. To put that in perspective, you could drive around the entire island. You know, traffic is one thing, but you can drive around the entire island, I kid you not, in a half a day. Imagine imagine trying to drive across Canada in a half a day. Good luck. You can probably get across a city if you're lucky, depending on what time it is, right? So to move forward that social mobility, you had to go somewhere. You had to do something, right? So if you have those opportunities, whether it's a Panama Canal or going to Guyana, you know, there's a lot of Barbadians and teachers going through the Caribbean, right? What we call farm workers or seasonal agricultural workers going, you know, up to the U.S., going to Canada, which you see right now if you have an opportunity going through southwestern Ontario, working there. You had Bajans in the coal mines in Nova Scotia. Like my grandfather during the Second World War was in New York helping building ships. It's the same thing, and for a lot of folks who may not understand, if you're a university kid and you don't have a university around you, and you're like, hey, I gotta go to school somewhere, what do? You get in your car, you drive 5 hours. For those opportunities. You need a job. What do? You fly across the country. What do? You move cities. You need to buy a home. You can't afford a home in Toronto, so you go to Milton. It's the exact same thing. So those opportunities. So yes, it's social mobility, and I tie that in particularly into my book. But the key for this is it wasn't because they were just forced to do it. It wasn't because they say, I need to leave. It was looking for those opportunities. And not only looking for those opportunities, is they had to have the skills to be able to take those opportunities. Canada, North America, and UK at the time were only looking for quote-unquote highly skilled folks. So you had to be highly educated. So when I say autonomous, these are people who sat in their homes with their parents and their grandparents and said, you are going to be quote-unquote better. You remember, we're looking in, you know, early 20th century, mid 20th century. These are people whose grandparents, great-grandparents, either were touched by enslavement or were in enslavement. So you're talking about people who were legislated to be ignorant, who were not be able to be educated, read and write during enslavement, who are now leapfrogging to be highly skilled and highly educated to have that social mobility. So again, it's really important for folks to understand that these just weren't folks that said, you know what, I'm getting on a boat and go somewhere. No, that's not how immigration works. How migration works. So definitely social mobility.
And then, of course, I want to go back to what you mentioned about in terms of autonomous migration. You know, what does it mean in the context of Barbadian movement and how it differed from other forms of Caribbean migration? I think you touched upon it, but if we can go a little bit deeper on that one.
So I look at it two ways. And without getting too, I could spend hours on this. Because one way, I always have to kind of pause when I say autonomous, is because we're still operating within a colonial framework, right? And this is where I always like to time out with Canadians a lot. I'm like, well, you know, Canada was a colony, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same way Barbados or Jamaica or Grenada were colonies, Canada was the same. And I always like to kind of needle Canadians too and to say, well, you know, after the 7 Years' War in 1763, when France was defeated by the UK, and you look at the Quebec Act in 1774, one of the things was that France didn't want to give up their highly profitable enslaved colonies that were producing all the sugar. So they're like, you know, take Quebec. Just like, yeah, you know, take Quebec. For a lot of people, that's unimaginable. Like, you would take that over somewhere like Guadeloupe or Martinique that are this big, but in that particular context, right? So I like to frame that there to say, yes, the movement was still happening within colonial systems. So to be educated, you're still being educated within a British system. You know, you write your 11 plus, your common entrance exam. You're still learning about kings and queens and snow when you've never seen snow in your life to be able to migrate in that space. That being said, though, when I really want to tie the autonomous, I'm not just tying autonomous as to the individual, but I'm also tying autonomous to the colonial governments. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the migration papers, particularly for domestics, so when I say domestics, these were the women, and I'll say this for decades and decades and decades. it was Black women, particularly the second iteration of the domestic scheme in the 1950s, 1955, that opened the doors, not just for Black men, but for all newcomers in Canada, by them de-skilling themselves, whether they were teacher, professional, whatever, to be indentured servants in someone's home, and teaching folks, again, this autonomy that they understood. The government was like, this is the only way you can get here because it's still a racist immigration system. So they all were pushing and saying, hey, be an ambassador. If you look at the archives, it says, be an ambassador. Donald Moore, the NCA, said, be an ambassador. Because once you're an ambassador, and Canadians in these white households can see how good you are, that you're not just a stereotype, quote unquote, that is going to allow more folks to come. So that autonomy isn't just autonomy in the neoliberal sense of the individual that we understand it here. It's the autonomy of the collective. That if we make these individual choices that do not fall under stereotypes, it is going to help our entire society. And that's the collective Blackness that was so apparent in the post-war, the 50s and 60s, that we've kind of lost now. I know it kind of segued a little bit, but we kind of lost that now, because autonomy meant collectiveness, meant unity, meant as a group, meant if we do this together, it's going to support each other, it's going to support our kids and our grandkids, and so on and so forth.
No, definitely. And I guess with this, again, the migration, how it's shaping in the family life, and of course, gender roles in these communities. Were there, notable changes in how people saw home and, of course, belonging?
So, those are the pros and cons, right? So, for example, if you look at the domestic scheme, so I'll use that as a thread here.
Yes.
These women had to be unmarried. They couldn't have kids officially. They couldn't have kids because they need to move here by themselves. So what you were seeing, and I know some people on this call might understand this in a very personal way, what you're seeing is these women had to leave their kids, not just child, kids, families, at home, in Barbados, in Antigua, wherever it is, for years. And you see it now, for example, if you look, think about the Living Caregiver Program, the women from the Philippines, they never see the kids for decades. And that completely shifted the dynamic of the family unit, right? Kids being raised by aunties and kids being raised by grandparents and grandmothers and so on and so forth. And mothers never seeing the formative years of their kids, right? There's a double-edged sword to that, because it really reiterated it takes a village to raise a child. But at the end of the day, you're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and your mother packs up and leaves. It takes a toll. Yes, you're getting a barrel. Yes, those remittances are coming in. Yes, you get a nice new wall house and you get school clothes and all that stuff. And with the hope eventually you'll get that one letter that says, hey, you're coming, right? You're coming in September, you're starting school, but you're missing those years with your mother, right? And these are the sacrifices that, and I'll always say that women particularly had to play, not thinking about just their well-being, but the future of their kids and their grandparents and their grandkids. So no, it definitely shifted the gender. And it's the same thing. If you look at the Panama Canal, the men were going. So kids didn't have the fathers around. The seasonal agricultural workers program, the men were going. And so it was always funny that immigration, and a lot of folks know this already, is highly gendered.
Yes.
Highly, highly gendered. And it's not just with Black folks. You look at the Chinese head tax, the Chinese building the railroad, they just wanted the men, because if you brought the women, they're going to have families, they're going to stay. But if you got the men, they're going to go home. I'm like, well, I don't know if you know about gender. It doesn't really work like that. But anyways, so it really shifted dynamics. And again, it has impacts to this day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's just these are the kind of the intangible connections that a parent and a child would have that has been broken, and it's been replaced by the tangible connections, which don't necessarily last very long. They don't. So,
and I'm glad you said it. And look, and what people don't understand is in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s,
yes.
There was no WhatsApp. WhatsApp video calling, right? Like, you get a letter with some photos in it. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know that we, probably go on about that one, but it just shows that, it definitely changed the dynamics. And even if there was a, reconnection, it didn't feel like a real reconnection, if you know what I mean, right? So the other point that I want to go back to again is about, flying fish as the symbol of, adaptable, migratory, and of course being resilient. But how does it reflect, I guess, the spirit and story of Barbadians abroad?
One thing about a Bajan or a Barbadian abroad would be they'll never ever forget to let you know they're from Barbados. It's never a situation that, yes, we were flying fish and now we are salmon, right? Because you would easily use the same kind of imagery of, the salmon going, in some Canadian river somewhere going upstream. They're same jumping upstream in the same battle. So the imagery that flying fish remain themselves, even though you're no longer in the sea, no longer in the warm waters, you're literally in the great white north of lake water, of river water, remain who you are. And this is key. And this is fundamentally key. And if you want to get into, academic jargon of the transnational habitus, right? That the habits that you were brought up in, the culture that you were brought up in, yes, you have the ability to quote unquote assimilate and adapt and code switch and have these segmented identities and being multiple, this cognitive dissonance, being multiple different people. But the core of it, on a Sunday, without fail, you're going to have rice and peas, some form of animal, some form of meat, right? It's going to be between the hours of dinner, is going to be lunch, sometime between 1 and 4, right? That's what it's going to be. And so that's the key with that imagery of the flying fish, that you never lose a sense of who you are. You might sound real different at work, but when you come home, this is it.
Yeah. And those are the defining moments. And then, of course, were there specific Canadian cities or regions where Barbadian migrants concentrated? Like what type of communities or networks did they build once they arrived?
So a lot of people will understand Toronto, right? But if you look at the first waves, it's actually down east. So Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. And the reason for that is, and then people don't know, like, for example, the Bank of Nova Scotia had a branch in the 1880s in Jamaica before they had a branch in Toronto. Why? Because you're following those trade routes, enslavement, codfish, ackee and saltfish, right? Like cod. When's the last time you could fish for cod in the Caribbean Sea? It doesn't exist, right? These national dishes that are so common, saltfish is so common, you get fish cakes and whatnot. That's coming from down east. It's coming from, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and so on and so forth. Why? Because you had to feed enslaved people, right? And this is so ingrained with that natural movement of people and of monies and of trade that you get, these West Indies invasions in places, again, like Cape Breton, in which there's an interesting, I don't want to say interesting, but an anti-Black reason for that, because it's saying, well, you know what? Black people, you're from a hot climate, you can work in the coal mines, you'll be fine. Or if you're looking at, for example, Jamaican Maroons, they were exiled, and they said, well, we're gonna throw you to the coldest place we can think of, right? Nova Scotia, but then they're gonna build a citadel, and how all these things are gonna happen. So you see large communities down east, right? And then first is actually, if you look at, the central region, Montreal. Montreal, a lot of people like Montreal. Yeah, before Toronto became Toronto, Montreal was the hub. Students going to McGill, what we now know as Concordia. So if you think about the Sir Joe Williams Affair in 1969, those were West Indian students. Aunt Cool, she was a Bajan woman. Like, these are West Indian students going through those places. And as Toronto grew as a city, then you see folks moving over more into Toronto. And it just doesn't stop in Toronto. You see, Bajan West Indian communities in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC. Black folks have been in BC since the 1800s. Right? John Ware, one of the most famous quote-unquote cowboys in Albertan history, was a Black man. So wherever you look at, and I say this, wherever there's a job, you will find a West Indian, you'll find a Bajan, full stop, period. Yellowknife, you'll find them somewhere.
It is that we just have to uncover those stories to be able to look at them, because again, as I said to you before we started recording, it wasn't until, doing this family research and looking at these archival records that you see that migration was happening all the time, continually. It didn't just start, the faucet didn't just start. It was always happening. There was always movement. These islands were not siloed communities that nobody knew that they existed, so to speak.
I'm glad you say. I'll give you a funny story. If anybody knows Ontario and that 401 stretch really well on this call, and this is something that I've learned recently. So yes, I've always known, there's communities like, for example, Shrewsbury. So Shrewsbury, a very good colleague of mine, friend of mine, their family in Shrewsbury is one of the terminuses of the Underground Road. So you have these Black communities in places like Buxton, Chatham, and so on and so forth. So there's a Black history there, and African Canadian history. Yeah. But then one day, and for example, too, seasonal agricultural workers, quote unquote farm workers who settle in places down there in Listowel and Woodstock and whatnot. One day I was speaking with somebody. This is really recent, and they're saying, yeah, you know what, in Woodstock, there's a whole bunch of Jamaicans. I was like, what? I passed Woodstock, drive down the 401, you pass, and these are places that you just like, hey, I'm not going to stop, just keep on driving, right? But they're explaining to me these very large and vibrant communities, and like you said, if you could just drive by them, they're not going to be in a history book. You're not going to learn them in kindergarten, the grade 12 or 12th grade, or in high school, secondary school. It's these conversations, and you start peeling back the layers. You're like, wait a second. Like my first time going to Shrewsbury, my mind was, this is nearly 20 years ago. My mind was blown. I'm driving through farmlands, and next thing you know, you see Black people. I'm like, what? Right? So the history is there, but as we talked about before the podcast started, they're not in mainstream books, so you never know.
Exactly. So let's continue on that theme in terms of the archival and the sources. What records of oral histories helped you to reconstruct these stories, and what research were there that you faced in terms of challenges that you faced?
So one of the core challenges, particularly when I was doing a dissertation, my research, oral history was not seen as core, quote unquote, legitimate history. If it isn't written in a book, what is it? Oh, your mother told you this because it's passed down from your grandmother or your great grandma, whatever. So just to prove the validity of stories. And it's hard because, and we see this a lot, particularly in Indigenous research, that it's a part of that culture that, oral culture is a part of that. If you think about West African culture, the griots, right? These are the people telling the stories. They're not writing anything down and say, read a book. You have a storyteller. You have a griot, who's next to the king and the queen and royalty. That's how you pass down these histories. So for us, as West Indian, as Caribbean people, as Black people, stories, song, right? This is how we know who we are. And so now to go into a predominantly white institution and saying, well, you know what, I heard this story and somebody told me this, they're like, that's not valid, that's whatever. Is it written down? Be like, wait a second, but this is not how our culture works. So that was one of my core challenges, which is where I blended this line with my father. My father was telling his story. And so what I had to do now was make sure I had the archival written evidence to support that story, right? Which I was able to do, which, as you know, takes a lot of work. You're digging through lots of different things. If anybody trying to go through enslavement records, you're trying to find your family history, and you're like, a lot of the time I would sit down and say, well, if the person signed with an X, they were most likely enslaved because they were illiterate. And if one person signed with an X, another person signed their name, if we want to talk about colorism and pigmentocracies, maybe that person was closer to whiteness in terms of their phenotype, because then they can marry into the whiteness. But this is just speculation.
I wouldn't say that.
I wouldn't say that because deep down it's like, no, that's true. But that's another podcast.
Exactly.
You want to start talking about plate whites and clear whites and yeah, it goes into that. But that's we say that here because that's important, right? Even if you talk about oral histories, we all know that their family members, and you would not see this written down. Their family members, if one child was too dark, they couldn't go to a particular school.
Yes.
And if they couldn't go to a particular school, that means they had very different life opportunities. So this is why important is take those oral histories and then say, well, there is a true history of pigmentocracy. If you look at Jamaica and the legislation, it literally said if you're 6 times removed being black, you became white, which still makes absolutely no sense to me. Like, who was saying you're 6 times removed? Right? What does that mean? So it's key for us as as historians or as researchers or whomever is to legitimize, and I hate using that term, legitimize our stories to make them valid. Again, I hate using that term, quote unquote, to mainstream audiences, which I don't think is true, but that's the unfortunate reality of living.
No, and you're right. Those are definitely the challenges that we face in terms of being able to look at these records and using those stories to guide. Because I know for myself, I used my mother's stories to guide me through, and it turned out to be bang on with some surprises behind it.
Okay, cool.
Exactly, but and it just goes to show again with these migration stories, how do they contribute to, I guess, the broader conversation, of course, about Caribbean identity and, of course, the diaspora today.
Look, I think it works both ways, right?
Yeah.
It works both ways. And so for me, this could not telling everyday stories and every person's stories can also knock whiteness and white supremacy down a peg.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to how we're telling diaspora stories. I'll come back to that. But in terms of whiteness, there's a belief, if you watch any kind of movie, that every white person was a king or a queen and royalty and, had all kinds of money. And well, if you look at the truth, particularly during enslavement, there were a whole pile of poor whites. Whole pile of poor whites. If you look at places, for example, like, Bacon's Rebellion in the U.S., it was poor whites next to black folks and slave folks who were trying to overthrow what we call the 1%ers, the white elites. Imagine more white people understood that in the 2020s. That their actual family histories, they were, coming off ships because of Irish potato famines. That you had English colonizers literally starving you to death. And would you now back this whole imagined thing called whiteness? Or would you real more so have a class consciousness that these elites, these are the ones that we should all unite against? But no. You've been taught that to be white is better because you watched a movie that said whiteness is better. Or a book that said, well, I was, Jacques Cousteau, like Cartier and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, no, you weren't. You were poor and destitute. That's why they sent you over here. You were poor and destitute. You were criminalized. And your punishment was to be Barbados. And you became an Ecky Becky and a red leg in Barbados, right? Like, that's the story you need to tell. And so on the flip side, for us as black people, telling these diasporic stories will shift the narrative for us in a positive way, right? That not every black person was just an enslaved person. And even if you were enslaved, doesn't mean you were illiterate and this is a space you need to go to. You'll hear the stories of your mother or my father who came from, and I don't think a lot of people, particularly in Canada, understand abject poverty. Like, I don't think people understand you have to go to a pipe to get water. You ain't got no refrigeration. You ain't got no electricity. And this is a time in Canada when people got TVs and cars and all that kind of stuff. You got 8 siblings in the same bed. Like that, and then you can go from that in one single generation to a son and daughter who were both educators, with a son who's a professor. Like, that's unimaginable if you look at the course of quote unquote white history. So telling these stories, not just from my story, but from your story of quote unquote regular people, really shows what they had to do and what they've done for us to get here. And for young West Indians, young black folks, if you could just sit, even if it's 5 pages of an hour-long podcast, a 10-minute podcast, and something like, yeah, you know, my mother had to do this. This is where my mother came from. Imagine what that changes in your psyche of what you can do. That you have TV, internet, cell phone, electricity, house over, roofs over your head. Imagine what you could do with that. And that's the mentality I have. Like I say, you know, you gotta be rich with a poor man's attitude. Right? Just go and build off of the strength of your own family, not some person you never heard of. You. It's born in you. It's your genes. It's your DNA.
You know, you hit it right there in terms of building off of your own strength, because these are not negative stories. These are not stories that should be seen as, oh, well, they're dark, so to speak.
No.
These are really positive, moving stories that we can build off of this as to what everyone had to go through in order for you to be where you are today.
And that is key. And I always pause there too, and I say, and this, when I was starting to peel back layers of my father's story, my mother's story, it also made me understand as an adult, certain things they couldn't talk about.
Yes.
You talk about trauma. Nowadays we talk about trauma and mental health.
Yes.
You didn't talk about that.
No, couldn't.
My father's on London transport, and he'd be telling stories about the racism, like the racism from the UK in the 50s and the 60s. Wild. And you start to understand, oh, this is, because that's some deep, what we now know as trauma. Like you just had to literally, you got, post-traumatic slave syndrome that, Professor Joy DeGruy would talk about. Like, that you just had to suppress and go to work the next day.
Yes.
There is no workplace mental health break. Mm-hmm. There's no sick days. Mm-hmm. And this is happening to our own parents.
Exactly. Right? No, it's true. Absolutely.
And so I give pause, I give grace in this, deviating from the question a little bit, but I just want to make sure I get this in. Yeah. I give pause and I give grace to a lot of folks, the post-war, I call them immigrant ambassadors or autonomous Bajans in my book, the Black pioneers, those poor, who some people will say they sold out. You know what? They sold out to the system. They don't have an accent no more. They did it. I'm like, you know what they had to do to survive? To make sure they got paid? Yeah. Okay, they straightened their hair. You know you had to do that? You're going to come in the 60s and 70s with locks and trying to get a job? You had to adopt, quote-unquote, white ways of being to literally survive. So when you say they sold out and they gave up and they moved to the suburbs, I'm like, it's not quite. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Understand their stories, and the reason they can't talk about it, because it hurts so much.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this particular episode, what would you like the listeners to take away from this story of your book, Flying?
That everyone's story has value. I need, particularly your kids or grandkids now, just take out your cell phone. And one thing we know about West Indians, they like to talk. Let's say West Indians in a certain generation. You may not be able to get them to sit down and type something out, but just put the phone down, right? On a Sunday evening, or a Saturday when the evening, putting in salsa, whatever it is, and just put the phone down and hit record and let them talk. Those stories that you're like, Mom, you're boring me when you're a kid, I listen to them now with a very different eye and a very different ear. Because once they are gone, I don't think they'll understand this. Once they are gone, those stories are gone forever. So what I want people to take from this is listen to their stories. Mm-hmm. You don't need to press in for questions. Just listen to their stories and record them. You don't need to write a book. Just have it. And you can pass it down to your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, because then they're going to come back and remember, hey, this was my great whomever. And this is what they did. You don't need no ancestry.co.uk or me23, whatever. You have those stories, and those live on forever. So record your stories. They have value.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for that, because that is definitely, as I said, that was the guiding light for me in terms of doing all this research is remembering the voice of my mother, who is no longer here, to be able to guide me through what I was able to uncover. So that is so great. And I will ensure to put all of your information in the show notes so people can be able to collect and connect on that. So thank you so much, Professor Stuart Taylor. Appreciate it.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your